They didn't slap her. They did something worse. They asked Zara Adeyemi to step aside at her father's funeral. In a room lined with billionaires, heads of state, and men whose signatures could start wars, she was gently moved away from the casket, like she was blocking something important. "Let the board handle this," one executive murmured. "It's procedural now." Procedural. Her father's body hadn't even been lowered yet, and they were already dividing his empire in whispers. The glass cathedral overlooking the Atlantic was silent except for the low hum of private security radios. Black marble floors reflected chandeliers that cost more than most cities' annual budgets. Every seat in the front row was occupied by power: sovereign wealth fund directors, oil magnates, tech oligarchs, and men whose wealth never appeared on any public list. Zara stood in simple black silk. No diamonds, no entourage, no speech prepared. Just grief. But grief, in rooms like this, was considered weakness. When she stepped toward the podium to say a final word for her father, the chief financial officer intercepted her smoothly, smiling for the cameras. "Not today," he said quietly. "This is corporate territory now." Corporate territory. As if she had wandered into a meeting she wasn't invited to. Behind the executives, near the back wall of tinted glass, stood Adriano Moretti, tailored charcoal suit, hands folded behind his back, expression unreadable. He didn't speak. He didn't intervene. He watched. Everyone knew who he was. International logistics magnate. Silent shareholder in 3 of her father's most aggressive expansions. Whispers called him something else. Mafia. But in rooms like this, the word used was strategic partner. Zara felt the eyes on her. Not sympathetic. Assessing. Measuring. Was she fragile? Was she emotional? Was she irrelevant? A board member leaned toward another and said, just loud enough for her to hear, "She was never trained for this." Another replied, "She doesn't even understand what he built." They weren't talking about inheritance. They were talking about control. What none of them realized was that control had already shifted. 47 minutes earlier, biometric authorizations embedded within the Adeyemi Global Trust had initiated Phase 7 of her father's succession protocol. A condition had been met. Not financial. Not legal. Character-based. If Zara maintained composure under public displacement. If she chose restraint over retaliation. If she honored the room instead of fighting it, full executive authority would transfer automatically. She didn't know that. She only knew her father's body was 10 feet away. And strangers were deciding who she was allowed to be. When the final hymn ended, the board gathered in a tight circle near the front. Lawyers moved discreetly. Secure phones lit up. Zara stepped back. Not defeated. Observing. Across the room, Adriano Moretti's gaze finally met hers. And for a fraction of a second, he inclined his head. Not in sympathy. In acknowledgement. The test was already over. The empire just hadn't realized it yet. 2 days later, the board would learn what happens when you mistake composure for weakness. And the men who asked her to step aside would discover something terrifying. She had never been standing outside the empire. She was the empire. The hymn faded, but the silence that followed felt heavier. Zara remained where they had repositioned her, 3 steps away from her father's casket, close enough to touch the polished wood, far enough to signal she no longer belonged at its center. The glass cathedral lived up to its name. Floor-to-ceiling panels revealed the restless Atlantic beyond, waves crashing against dark rock as if nature itself refused stillness. Inside everything was measured, controlled. Even grief moved in disciplined increments. Rows of black tailored suits filled the front section. Sovereign wealth executives, energy magnates, defense contractors, men who had built empires out of scarcity and then monetized the cure. Their expressions were solemn, but their eyes were alert, watching each other, calculating. Near the altar, the board formed a quiet crescent. Their posture wasn't mourning, it was positioning. A few spoke in low tones, heads inclined just enough to disguise strategy as sympathy. Transition timing must be contained, one murmured. Markets open in 48 hours. We can't afford uncertainty. Uncertainty. That was what they called her. Zara's hands rested loosely in front of her. She had inherited her father's stillness, the ability to let a room reveal itself before speaking. From this angle, she could see everything. The CFO's impatience hidden behind polished condolences, the legal counsel scrolling through encrypted messages, the vice chair calculating which alliances would fracture first. No one looked at her directly. That was the point. She was meant to feel peripheral. Adriano Moretti hadn't moved. He stood near the back where shadow met glass, removed from the cluster of executives yet somehow more central than all of them. His presence bent the room subtly like gravity. When the final eulogy ended, the chairman stepped forward. Mr. Adeyemi was a visionary. He began, voice smooth, authoritative. His legacy will continue under careful stewardship. Careful stewardship. Not family. Not blood. Stewardship. A ripple of agreement passed through the board. Subtle nods. Silent endorsements. Zara felt it then. Not anger, not grief, but displacement. They were already rehearsing a future that excluded her. A junior executive approached with a respectful half-smile. Miss Adeyemi, perhaps you'd prefer to sit? The next segment is internal. Internal. She met his eyes calmly. This is my father's funeral. He held her gaze a moment too long before stepping aside. Across the room, Adriano's expression shifted. Not visibly, but perceptibly. Approval, perhaps. Or recognition. Outside, thunder rolled across the ocean. Inside, phones vibrated almost simultaneously. The board members glanced down at their screens in synchronized reflex. Encrypted alerts. Authorization updates. A flicker of confusion passed between them. Zara's phone remained silent in her clutch. Now. She didn't know that somewhere within Adeyemi Global's secured servers, layers of encrypted succession code had just unlocked. She only knew the board had begun to look unsettled. And for the first time since they asked her to step aside, the room felt less certain, less controlled. Adriano finally moved. One slow step forward, as if adjusting his vantage point. Not intervening, just observing the shift. The ocean crashed harder against the cliffs outside. And beneath the glass cathedral's perfect stillness, something had already begun to fracture. The reception unfolded in restrained elegance. Crystal glasses, muted conversations, strategic condolences offered in carefully measured tones. The glass cathedral had shifted from ceremony to calculus. Zara stood near the edge of the terrace overlooking the ocean, the wind pressing lightly against her black silk dress. From here, she could see the board dispersed in clusters, tight circles forming and dissolving, alliances breathing in and out. She didn't approach them. She watched. And across the marble floor, Adriano Moretti watched her. He hadn't joined a single conversation. No handshake lingered too long in his presence. Men approached him with respect that bordered on caution. He responded with nods, brief murmurs, nothing wasted. He looked like a man at a private viewing rather than a funeral, assessing architecture, studying foundation lines. Zara had seen him before. Years ago in her father's office, when deals were spoken about in lowered voices and doors locked automatically. She remembered how her father had shifted subtly when Adriano entered. Not submissive. Not dominant. Cool. That memory surfaced now as Adriano stepped onto the terrace. He didn't stand beside her. He stopped a few feet away, angled toward the sea. Your father built something rare, he said at last, voice low, controlled. She didn't look at him. An empire. A system, he corrected. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Felt measured. Inside, a murmur rippled through the reception hall. One of the board members checked his phone again, this time not hiding the frown. Another stepped aside to make a call. Adriano's gaze flickered toward the movement, then back to the horizon. "Do you know," he asked quietly, "why men like them fear transition?" Zara finally turned slightly. "Because they lose control. Because they lose predictability," he replied. "Control is just the illusion of it." Her phone vibrated then. Once. Not repeatedly like the others. Single alert. She didn't check it. Adriano noticed. Something unreadable passed through his eyes. In the secured data centers 3 continents away, Adeyemi Global's internal governance framework had just completed its final verification sequence. Behavioral parameters met. Composure maintained. No retaliatory disruption detected. Phase 7 confirmed. Primary authority transfer queued. Zara felt a subtle shift in the room, like air pressure changing before a storm. Conversations shortened. Eyes darted. One executive excused himself abruptly. "Strange timing," she murmured. Adriano almost smiled. "Timing is rarely strange." Inside the hall, the chairman's voice rose slightly. Not in grief now, but in irritation. "That's impossible. Recheck the authentication." Zara's phone vibrated again. This time she glanced down. Encrypted notification. No subject line. Just one sentence. Executive control status updated. She didn't react. Across the terrace, Adriano watched her with precise attention. Not testing. Confirming. "You should go inside," he said calmly. "Why?" "Because they're about to realize something." "And what's that?" His eyes held hers fully now. "That the room no longer belongs to them." The wind shifted. The ocean struck the cliffs harder. Behind the glass, tension rose in visible waves. And for the first time, Zara understood that Adriano Moretti hadn't come to mourn. He had come to witness a transfer. 2 days later, the sky over the financial district was clear in a way that felt deliberate. Zara arrived alone. The hearing was not held in a courtroom but in Adeyemi Global's executive arbitration chamber, a circular room of glass and steel suspended above the city. No press, no assistants, no extended family. Only the board's senior legal counsel, and one independent executor appointed years ago under confidentiality clauses no one had fully understood at the time. Adriano Moretti was already seated when she entered. He did not greet her. He didn't need to. The chairman gestured toward the empty seat at the far end of the polished obsidian table. "Miss Adeyemi," he began smoothly, "this is a procedural confirmation of transitional governance." Procedural again. Zara took her seat without comment. In the center of the table sat a biometric console. Black glass inactive. It had been installed during the company's last infrastructure overhaul, described publicly as a multi-factor continuity safeguard. No one had questioned it. The independent executor, a gray-haired woman with precise movements and no visible allegiance, opened a slim encrypted tablet. "As stipulated in the Adeyemi Global Trust," she said calmly, "final executive authority is contingent upon behavioral compliance metrics measured during the ceremonial period." A faint crease appeared between the chairman's brows. Behavioral metrics. She didn't elaborate. Instead, she turned the tablet toward Zara. "Please place your hand on the console." Subtle resistance moved around the table, exchanged glances, quiet discomfort. One board member leaned forward. "We agreed the interim structure would remain intact until shareholder review." "You agreed," the executor replied evenly. "Mr. Adeyemi structured otherwise." Zara placed her palm against the cool glass. The console illuminated beneath her skin, mapping vascular patterns, pulse rhythm, microtremor stability. For a second nothing happened. Then every device in the room vibrated at once. Authorization hierarchy updated. Voting shares consolidated. Primary signatory reassigned. Across the globe, encrypted ledgers recalibrated. Offshore accounts locked and reopened under new credentials. Satellite-linked shipping networks refreshed chain-of-command protocols. The transfer wasn't symbolic. It was operational. The chairman's tablet flickered, then displayed a single line. Executive control, Zara Adeyemi. 62.4% direct authority. That's not possible, someone said under their breath. Adriano didn't speak. He watched. The executor's voice remained steady. Phase 7 succession protocol confirmed. Effective immediately. All executive and strategic authority rests with Miss Adeyemi. Phones rang. Calls were declined. One board member attempted to access a restricted file. Access denied. Another security clearance downgraded in real time. Zara removed her hand from the console. The room felt smaller now. Different. She didn't smile. Didn't celebrate. She simply looked around the table, at men who had dismissed her as ornamental, procedural, irrelevant. I assume, she said quietly, we can begin. No one interrupted her. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Traffic flowing, markets opening, unaware that $800 billion had just shifted hands without a single raised voice. Across the table, Adriano Moretti inclined his head once. Not in submission. In acknowledgement. The empire had recognized its sovereign. And this time the room belonged to her. The emergency session was called before the elevators finished descending. Within 30 minutes, the same men who had offered controlled condolences at the funeral were seated again around the obsidian table, this time without ceremony. No crystal water glasses. No rehearsed sympathy. Just tension. Zara remained at the head of the table, not because she claimed it, but because the system had assigned it. Her credentials now controlled the room's encryption, the internal feeds, even the privacy glass that sealed them off from the skyline. The chairman spoke first. This transfer was triggered prematurely, he said, voice steady but tight. We need to initiate a temporary suspension pending shareholder clarification. Across from him, legal counsel nodded. There are mechanisms for override in extraordinary circumstances. Extraordinary. Zara listened without interrupting. Around the table, screens lit up with projections. Clauses, bylaws, contingency pathways. A strategy was already forming. Delay her authority. Challenge the interpretation. Frame it as fiduciary protection. Not defiance. Protection. One director leaned forward. With respect, Miss Adeyemi, your father built a complex geopolitical machine. It requires experience, stability, continuity. Translation, not you. Zara folded her hands lightly. Continuity is already in place. The biometric protocol was never meant to grant unilateral control, another insisted. It was a safeguard. It was a decision, she replied calmly. Adriano remained silent, seated midway down the table. He had not aligned himself with either side. His stillness made others uneasy. The chairman exhaled slowly. We're invoking Section 14. Provisional review. A quiet murmur of agreement moved around the room. The executor, present but detached, tapped her tablet. Section 14 requires majority board consensus and secondary authorization from the primary signatory. All eyes shifted to Zara. If you agree, the chairman continued carefully, this becomes procedural. Cooling period. 90 days. 90 days was enough time to restructure influence, mobilize allies, dilute her control through legal friction. Zara understood that without being told. On the far wall, one of the screens blinked. Access attempt detected. Unauthorized retrieval of restricted offshore data. The system responded automatically. Privileges suspended. A director's tablet went dark in his hands. What did you just do? He demanded. Zara hadn't moved. I didn't do anything, she said quietly. The system did. The room absorbed that. Not anger. Not panic. Recognition. Her authority wasn't theoretical. It was embedded. The chairman tried once more. You don't have to assert dominance immediately. Power can be collaborative. Collaboration requires trust, Zara replied. You began restructuring before my father was buried. Silence. No one denied it. She leaned slightly forward. Not aggressive, just present. Section 14 denied, she said. The system registered the command instantly. Override pathway closed. Several phones vibrated again. Notifications of attempted review rejected. Across the table, Adriano finally spoke. Gentlemen, he said evenly, if you're going to challenge a sovereign, you should at least confirm the crown isn't welded to her head. No one laughed. Because they understood. This wasn't an emotional confrontation. It was structural. The emergency session had been their last immediate attempt. And it had failed. The room was no longer negotiating whether she had power. Only how they would survive under it. The building was quieter after the emergency session, but not calmer. Zara remained in the executive chamber long after the board dispersed. The skyline beyond the glass had shifted from late afternoon gold to the cool steel of evening. Below, the city pulsed with its usual indifference. On the table in front of her, encrypted folders waited. When she authenticated her credentials, the interface changed. Layers that had never been visible under her father's administration unfolded like concealed architecture. Subsidiaries nested inside nonprofits, shipping routes routed through shell jurisdictions, private equity arms cross-linked with humanitarian foundations. It was elegant, and it was intentional. A notification flagged a cluster of transactions labeled Maritime Logistics Optimization. The phrasing was sterile. The numbers were not. Billions redirected through intermediary ports in regions known for regulatory opacity. Insurance waivers signed under emergency provisions that never appeared in public reports. Silent partners masked through trusts registered in 3 different continents. Zara traced the structure slowly. Every path led somewhere. Some led to energy corridors in politically unstable territories. Others led to supply chains whose cargo was never itemized in full. One node connected directly to a holding company she recognized. Moretti Holdings. She didn't react. She opened the file. The ownership percentages were small on paper. Minority positions. Advisory roles. Strategic risk buffers. But the leverage embedded in them was significant. Influence without exposure. The door behind her opened quietly. Adriano entered without announcement. "You're thorough," he observed. She didn't turn. "You're integrated." Faint pause. "Integrated," he repeated, as if testing the word. She rotated the screen toward him. Maritime routes through Trieste. Emergency waivers in Lagos. Insurance caps rerouted through Singapore. His gaze flicked across the data without visible surprise. "Your father understood that global stability requires flexibility," he said. "Flexibility," she echoed softly. On the screen, a series of restructures appeared. Entire labor divisions dissolved under efficiency mandates. Thousands displaced during periods that coincided with expansion into shadow corridors. Efficiency had funded opacity, and opacity had funded growth. Zara leaned back slightly. Did he believe this was necessary? Adriano's expression remained composed. He believed in control. "That's not the same." "No," he agreed. Silence settled between them. Not hostile, not comfortable. Calculated. "You're reviewing the networks as if you intend to dismantle them," he said. "I'm reviewing them to understand what they cost," she replied. Outside the glass, the city lights sharpened. The world ran on systems like these. Invisible scaffolding supporting visible order. If she pulled too hard, markets would tremble. If she left them untouched, she would become custodian of a machine built on selective blindness. Another file opened automatically. Humanitarian restructuring initiatives that coincided precisely with offshore liquidity surges. Pattern. Not corruption in the traditional sense. Redirection. Reallocation. Sacrifice disguised as strategy. Zara closed the file. "When the board said I didn't understand what he built," she said quietly, "this is what they meant." Adriano studied her for a long moment. "Yes." She looked back at the screen, at the architecture of power she had inherited. Not just wealth, infrastructure, leverage, compromise. The empire had not been designed to be clean. It had been designed to endure. And now she had to decide whether endurance was enough. By morning, the decision had already begun forming. Zara stood alone in the smaller strategy room adjacent to the executive floor. No glass cathedral. No ceremonial table. Just a long matte surface, embedded screens, and a live data feed mapping Adeyemi Global's active restructuring programs across 5 continents. The numbers moved in clean, obedient lines. Humanitarian realignment initiatives. Efficiency-driven consolidation. Temporary workforce displacement. The language was immaculate. The impact was not. She tapped into the labor analytics dashboard. Thousands of contracts flagged for termination under transition optimization. Regions highlighted in amber. West Africa, Eastern Europe, parts of Southeast Asia, where divested assets quietly overlapped with the shadow maritime routes she had traced the night before. Sacrifice disguised as necessity. The door opened behind her. The chairman entered first this time, followed by 2 board members and legal counsel. Adriano came last, silent as ever. "We were informed you called this session," the chairman said carefully. "I did." She didn't sit. Neither did they. On the central screen, she projected a cross-reference map. Humanitarian restructures aligned with offshore liquidity surges. A few faces tightened. "These programs were approved years ago," one director said. "They're structurally sound. They're strategically profitable," Zara corrected. "That is not a crime." "No," she agreed. "It's a choice." She tapped the console. "Effective immediately," she said evenly. "All active humanitarian restructures are frozen pending independent audit." The room went still. "That would halt expansion in 3 major corridors," legal counsel replied quickly. "We have contractual obligations." "Those obligations remain intact," Zara said. "But workforce termination sequences stop now." A director exhaled sharply. "You can't simply reverse 10 years of calibrated positioning because it makes you uncomfortable. This isn't about comfort. It's about leverage," he snapped. "Yes," she said. "It is." Silence. On the wall, automated notifications began dispatching. Suspension orders, audit triggers, compensation review holds. Somewhere in Singapore, a division head would be staring at a red notification. In Lagos, a shipping coordinator would receive an instruction to pause decommissioning. Across the network, the machine slowed. Adriano finally spoke. "You understand this will disrupt several aligned interests." "I do. And if those interests respond, then they respond." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The chairman stepped closer to the screen. "Markets interpret freezes as instability." "Markets adapt," she replied. "And if they don't?" Zara met his gaze without hostility. "Then perhaps the model was more fragile than we admitted." Another notification appeared. Confirmation that workforce termination flags had been suspended. Thousands of pending job losses placed on hold in less than 60 seconds. No applause. No acknowledgement. Just consequence. Adriano studied her openly now. Not testing. Evaluating. "You move quickly," he observed. "Delay favors those already positioned," she said. Beat past. Outside the room, the empire recalibrated under new parameters. Not dismantled. Not purified. Interrupted. For the first time since the funeral, Zara felt the weight of command settle fully into place. Not inherited. Exercised. And in the quiet that followed, the board understood something fundamental. She wasn't reacting. She was governing. The disruption did not come from the board. Came from Adriano. 3 nights after the freeze, Zara received a secure request routed through a private channel that bypassed corporate servers entirely. Location attached. No explanation. She went alone. The meeting was set in one of Adeyemi Global's maritime logistics terminals at the edge of the harbor. Steel, salt air, and quiet machinery resting between shipping cycles. Floodlights cut clean lines across stacked containers branded with subsidiaries most people never noticed. Adriano stood near the water, coat unbuttoned, hands resting lightly behind his back. The tide moved in slow, deliberate pulls. "You've created friction," he said without turning. "I expected resistance." "Resistance," he replied softly, "is predictable. Instability is not." She stepped beside him, maintaining a measured distance. "Is this where you explain that I've endangered something I don't fully understand?" He looked at her then, faint amusement flickering through restraint. "No. This is where I determine whether you do." A container crane shifted in the distance, its metallic groan echoing across the harbor. He handed her a tablet. On the screen, rerouted cargo manifests, delayed clearances, financial derivatives tied to halted corridors. "You froze humanitarian restructures," he said. "Those restructures funded liquidity buffers protecting high-risk shipping lanes." "I know. And if those buffers collapse, then we expose the lanes to scrutiny." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Scrutiny attracts attention. Attention invites interference. Interference invites opportunists." "Like you?" she asked calmly. Faint pause. "Like anyone," he corrected. The wind shifted off the water, sharp and cold. "You're testing whether I understand consequence," she said. "I'm testing whether you understand leverage." She met his gaze fully now. Leverage without accountability becomes dependency. And accountability without power becomes symbolic. Silence settled between them, heavier than before. In the distance, a ship's horn cut through the night. "You inherited a system designed to survive storms," Adriano said quietly. "Survival sometimes requires shadows." "And shadows," she replied, "sometimes become the structure." He studied her for a long moment, not as an adversary, not as a subordinate, as an equal variable. "You could have dismantled the networks publicly," he said. "You didn't. Public dismantling fractures markets. You could have ignored them. That would fracture me." A slow exhale escaped him. Not frustration, not approval. Recognition. "You're not naive," he concluded. "No. And you're not sentimental." "No." The harbor lights reflected in the dark water between them. "You've altered the flow," he said finally. "But you haven't destabilized it." "Not yet," she answered. A faint smile touched his expression, restrained, almost imperceptible. "Good." He took back the tablet. "This was not a warning," he added. "It was calibration." She understood. He hadn't come to threaten. He had come to measure whether her authority was reactive or strategic. "And your conclusion?" she asked. Adriano looked out at the ships preparing to depart under revised clearance codes. "You're not dismantling the empire," he said. "You're rewriting it." The tide pulled harder against the dock. For the first time since the funeral, the tension between them shifted. Not adversarial. Aligned. Two forces testing structural limits, not to collapse them but to understand their load-bearing weight. And in that quiet harbor, beneath steel and salt and guarded silence, mutual recognition settled into place. The restructuring did not make headlines. It moved quietly, like a current shifting beneath still water. Zara did not announce reforms. She did not hold press conferences or issue statements about ethical pivots. Instead, she altered architecture. Oversight committees were expanded, not with loyalists, but with auditors who had previously declined Adeyemi contracts over transparency concerns. Voting thresholds for humanitarian reallocations were raised. Offshore liquidity buffers were reclassified under a dual signature requirement, dissolving the automatic flow that once favored shadow corridors. Nothing dramatic. Just friction introduced where silence used to exist. In Lagos, suspended workforce terminations converted into retraining stipends tied to port modernization projects. In Eastern Europe, a shuttered manufacturing line reopened under a revised capital structure that capped executive bonuses against labor cuts. The margins narrowed. Not dangerously, deliberately. At headquarters, the board adapted with visible restraint. Resistance no longer surfaced in emergency motions. It manifested in cautious cooperation, in subtle recalibrations of tone. They had tested her authority. Now they were testing her endurance. Zara welcomed that. In the executive chamber, she reviewed impact reports alone. Charts reflected reduced volatility in regions once dependent on opaque transfers. Revenue projections dipped slightly in one quarter, stabilized in the next. The empire had not fractured. It had adjusted. Adriano observed the changes without commentary at first. He attended meetings, reviewed documents, offered no obstruction. Until one evening, as twilight thinned across the skyline, he spoke. "You've tightened the system without suffocating it," he said, standing by the glass wall. "Survival doesn't require secrecy," she replied. "It requires balance." "Balance," he echoed, "is often temporary." She didn't disagree. The new Oversight Division submitted its first independent report that week. It flagged 3 maritime corridors previously protected by discretionary insurance shields. Instead of dissolving them, Zara redirected them under transparent regulatory partnerships. Less profitable, more visible. Message. Not to the public. To the network. The empire would operate in daylight where possible. And where shadow remained necessary, it would be measured. The chairman requested a private audience soon after. "You're reducing leverage," he said plainly. "I'm redistributing it. Power concentrated is efficient. Power concentrated is fragile." He studied her in silence, perhaps remembering the funeral. How easily they had dismissed her. "You're changing the culture," he said at last. "No," she corrected softly. "I'm clarifying it." Outside the building, markets closed with modest gains. Analysts noted stability. Investors cited disciplined governance. No one mentioned morality. They never did. Weeks passed. Systems recalibrated. Incentives aligned differently. Risk exposure diversified across accountable channels. Not revolution. Correction. Late one evening, Zara returned to the smaller strategy room and opened her father's archived succession notes. A single line stood out. "Endurance without conscience becomes empire. Conscience without endurance becomes collapse." She closed the file slowly. Power had not softened under her leadership. It had sharpened, but not toward fear, toward structure. Across the city, lights burned in thousands of offices connected to Adeyemi Global's network. The machine still ran. Simply ran differently now. And for the first time since the biometric console illuminated beneath her palm, Zara felt the architecture shift from inherited weight to deliberate design. Not purified. Not absolved. Rewritten. 18 months later, the empire was quiet. That was the measure of success. Markets opened without tremor. Shipping lanes moved under revised clearances. Quarterly reports reflected disciplined growth, narrower margins, steadier foundations. Analysts used words like resilient, recalibrated, strategically mature. No one used the word changed. Zara preferred it that way. She had moved into her father's former office but altered nothing cosmetic. The dark would remain. The city still stretched beyond the glass in restless geometry. Only the screens had shifted. Less emphasis on expansion, more on exposure metrics, labor impact ratios, regulatory transparency. The machine still breathed. It simply no longer hid its lungs. Adriano stood near the window one evening as rain threaded down the glass. "You've stabilized it," he said. "Yes. And the board. They've adapted. They always do." His reflection lingered beside hers in the darkened pane. 2 silhouettes framed by a skyline that never paused. "You removed certain shadows," he continued. "You left others intact. Some structures cannot be dismantled without collapse," she replied. "And you're comfortable carrying that compromise?" Comfort was not the word. "I'm aware of it." Silence settled, not tense, not resolved. The humanitarian audits had restored thousands of positions. Maritime corridors operated under clearer oversight. Offshore buffers now required layered accountability. The empire endured without hemorrhaging trust. Yet endurance came with its own cost. Zara rarely slept deeply. Not from fear. From awareness. Every decision she had made was precise. Each correction rippled outward in ways she could track, but not always predict. Where systems had tightened, new pressures formed. Where leverage had been diffused, influence redistributed itself in subtler patterns. Control was never permanent, only negotiated. A message blinked across her private screen, confirmation that another regulatory review had closed without incident. No action required. The phrase echoed strangely. In another part of the city, a division once tied to opaque liquidity corridors now operated under revised frameworks. Profits were slimmer. Risk was visible. Investors adjusted. But somewhere within the restructured architecture, quiet trade-offs remained. Strategic alignments that kept the global network intact. You could have chosen disruption, Adriano said quietly. Revolution. And fractured the spine of the system, she answered. He inclined his head slightly. You chose endurance. I chose responsibility. He studied her for a long moment. Responsibility, he said, is heavier than dominance. Yes. The rain slowed. The city lights sharpened again. After he left, Zara remained at the window. She thought of the funeral, of being asked to step aside, of standing in silence while others assumed her irrelevance. Now no one asked her to move. No one questioned her authority. But authority was not the same as peace. She opened her father's final archived note, the one she rarely revisited. Power reveals what you are willing to become. She closed it gently. She had preserved the empire. She had corrected its course without dismantling its spine. Stability had been achieved. Yet beneath that stability lingered a quieter question, one she carried alone. Had she rewritten power? Or simply learned to wield it more elegantly? Outside, the city moved forward, indifferent and alive. And inside the glass tower, control remained hers. Not celebrated. Not absolved. Just held.